We're in a series right now on how to interpret different literary styles in the Bible. This week we're going to focus on Old Testament narratives, which make up about 1/3 of the entire Bible. So let's get into it. So first, Old Testament narratives are historical stories that in the Bible describe real events and real people. They include whole or parts of a lot of different books like Genesis, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Jonah, and so many others. So every Old Testament narrative has multiple layers of narrative in it that are all unfolding at once. And these are typically referred to as the meta narrative or the grand narrative. And this is the overarching story of God's relationship with all of creation, all of humanity, and it covers things like creation, humanity's fall, redemption, restoration, and then God's plan for all people. Next, there's this covenantal or national narrative, and this is the story of God's relationship with Israel, his chosen people, over the course of the Old Testament era. This includes things like the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, as well as God's people's exodus and exile and return. And then the third one is the personal narrative. These are the specific stories of individuals within that larger national and cosmic framework, and it includes people like Abraham, Moses, Ruth, David, Esther, and so on. And so these three levels of narrative are all working together simultaneously. These individual stories, fit into the bigger story of Israel, which fits into the bigger, broader narrative of God's plan for all of humanity. So within each Old Testament narrative, there are the same few elements. With very few exceptions, Hebrew narratives tend to have an anonymous narrator, not always, like Daniel is Daniel, but this anonymous narrator also possesses some omniscience. They know what the characters are doing and thinking and feeling and saying, and they also tend to not add their own personal opinions to that. The narrators as well also tend to tell their stories in chronological order, but they tell the stories in scenes rather than every detail from start to finish. So it's a bit more like a play or a movie where there are gaps of time between scenes, but altogether they build into this full story. For example, the story of Moses, it begins with the king of Egypt, who's called Pharaoh. He orders the death of all the Hebrew baby boys, and then the next scene shows Moses, a Hebrew baby boy, being hidden by his mother. He's then found and raised by one of the Pharaoh's daughters, and then we jump to Moses as an adult, Moses fleeing to Midian after he kills someone, then him at the burning bush with God, who calls him to lead the Hebrew people and lead them out of slavery from Egypt. And then just the story continues from there. But what I'm getting at is each scene builds on the last, even those jumps in time, and they all push the story forward. So each story tends to focus on a few characters who are characterized by their actions and dialogue for the most part, as well as sometimes their role or social status or tribe. Moses, for example, he's biologically Hebrew man, but he's raised among Egyptians. He's later rejected, at least initially, by both groups, and he's also initially hesitant to lead God's people, but then he grows into, a strong, albeit imperfect leader of the Hebrew people, and someone who God uses despite his own personal flaws and weaknesses. So I want to move on. In Hebrew narratives, dialogue plays a crucial role. As I just talked about, it is one of the main ways that we learn about the different characters in these narratives, but it also tends to reveal key points in the story and drive the plot forward. And when it comes to the plot, Hebrew narratives typically tell a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. So they start usually by introducing a problem, and then that problem tends to get resolved by the end. The plot tends to move quickly, and it makes large jumps in time, like I mentioned, but it then slows down when the narrator wants to highlight key moments, so pay attention. In Moses' story, right, the main conflict is that the Pharaoh wants to keep the Israelites enslaved. God wants to free them. But then within this larger narrative, there are smaller stories like Moses' upbringing, his time in Midian, his interactions with Pharaoh, his interactions with the Israelites' time in the desert, and so on. So then the last element that I want to point out about Hebrew narratives is that they were meant to be heard, not just read. And so they use different techniques to capture and hold the listener's attention. These include things like repeating keywords or phrases to emphasize themes. This includes like framing the story by starting and ending with the same idea. It can include hinting at future events early on, or arranging ideas in meaningful patterns or chiasms. For example, in Moses' story, the Lord said appears frequently. Or in the first 9 plagues, there's a clear pattern, right? Moses warns Pharaoh before the first 2 plagues, then he doesn't warn him before a third, and then the sequence repeats 3 times, and that suggests a deliberate literary structure. So now I want to move into some best practices, and the first one is a big one, and it's this. So Old Testament narratives, they are primarily descriptive, not prescriptive. That means that they tell us what happened in Israel's history, but not necessarily what should have happened or what we are supposed to do. So an example is just because the Old Testament narratives include slavery and polygamy, that does not mean that God approved of those things. The people in the Old Testament narratives, they make bad choices, but instead of giving us direct moral lessons, these stories reveal a lot about God's character, how God, stays faithful and just and merciful despite our good or bad behavior. And then they also give us a little glimpse into what God's doing and how he works out his plans through imperfect people. Okay, another best practice is that it's really helpful and important to read Old Testament narratives from beginning to end if you want to grasp the full story, which of course you do. You wouldn't just read or watch 15 minutes of a 2-hour movie and then expect to understand the full story. And in the same way, you can't really grasp the full message of an Old Testament narrative unless you read it as a whole. So the next best practice is to focus on the text's clear intended meaning and be careful not to read into the text what wasn't there. So Old Testament narratives teach both explicitly and implicitly. For example, Moses, we explicitly learn that he has a brother and a sister, right? Exodus 4 tells us that Aaron is his brother, and Exodus 2 shows his sister watching over him as a baby. But then implicitly, we learn that Moses made a mistake when he struck the rock with his staff in the desert. And the text doesn't explicitly say that was wrong, but we learn that it's wrong because Moses faces consequences for it later on. So in both cases, explicit or implicit, the meaning is clear. Sometimes there are cultural and historical distances that make a passage not immediately clear to us, but with a little study, the meaning does become accessible. But here's my point. We should not look for hidden meaning in the text by, allegorizing it or personalizing it in a way that it was never meant to be. A couple examples, like in the story of David and Goliath, people sometimes say something like, David represents us and Goliath represents our problems. And then the stone David used to kill Goliath represents things like prayer or fasting or the right scripture verse. But that is well-intended, missing the meaning of the story. So David and Goliath isn't primarily about us and our personal challenges. It's about how God worked in history to deliver his people through a particular person at that time who happened to be David. And so the story is pointing to God's power and his faithfulness, not to a formula for our own victories. Keep in mind, though, that while the text's meaning is generally straightforward, that doesn't always mean that it's meant to be interpreted literally. Old Testament narratives often use literary devices like exaggeration and hyperbole in a similar way that we do today. For example, in Joshua 10, the text says that Joshua left no survivors and totally destroyed all who breathed. And this implies that the Israelites completely wiped out the Canaanites in battle. But then later in Judges, we see that there were many Canaanites still around. They were still living there. They were still fighting with the Israelites. So we know that totally destroyed was not literal. It's kind of like when my friend's kid tells me that they crushed the other team at his little t-ball match. And what we understand is that they won, maybe even by a lot, but no one was actually crushed. So to interpret these passages correctly, we can look for clues in the text, like how later chapters maybe inform and clarify earlier ones. It can also be really helpful to learn about the historical context. For example, in this case, totally destroyed turns out to be a common ancient Near Eastern military phrase that just meant a decisive victory, not complete extermination. So other tools we have are Bible commentaries, archaeological research, just other scholarly tools in general to help us understand the historical background behind the Old Testament stories. And then the last best practice for this week is that as you read an Old Testament narrative, try to keep in mind those three levels of the story: the individual story, the story of Israel as a nation, and then the overarching story of God's work in the world. As you're reading the individual story, just try to think about how it fits into the national story and then also the larger meta narrative and what that teaches us about God. So that's it for this week. If you want to follow along with this little series that we're doing and learn some best practices for reading and interpreting other common literary styles in the Bible, you can subscribe if you haven't already. Or if you'd like, I'd also encourage you to read the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I'm going to link it in the description, and that has been my main source for this series, so you can go deeper there. Otherwise, this week's question for the comment is, do you have a favorite scene or character from an Old Testament narrative? And if you do, what do you like about it? Of course, if you have general questions about Christianity or maybe even more about this particular topic, you are welcome to put those in the comments as well, and I'll do my best to respond there. A friendly heads up to all my regular watchers, I am planning on taking 2 weeks off the next couple Sundays. So I mentioned a while back that work's been busy, and it is still busy. So I just need a little downtime to charge my batteries, but I am going to come back, and I am really looking forward to it too. So thank you for being here. I appreciate you. I look forward to coming back fresh so I can give you my best. Have a great week. Bye.